Okay, this morning I'm happy to have a chance to talk to someone hailing from Madrid. His name is Wade Matthews. He came into my radar via Jane Regler, who pointed to him and says, please, if you get a chance, try and interview Wade. So I reached out, and luckily enough, I think I caught him in a mood to talk. So with that, I will introduce you to Wade Matthews. Hey, Wade, how's it going?
Hello, pleased to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. Let's start off by having you talk a little bit about your work. So I know you primarily through Jane and through her discussions of you as an improviser and as an electronic musician. But why don't you explain a little bit about how you think of what you do?
Well, that just about sums it up. I'm a free improviser. I work with electronics. I work with a laptop that I actually put on my lap. Might be interesting to add that since I come from playing acoustic instruments as well, I'm very interested in improvisation as collective process. I know a lot that one of the differences that emerges, I'm not sure whether this is true as much in the United States as it is in Europe, it may well be, between acoustic improvisers and electronic improvisers is there seem to be a lot of people, electronic improvisers, who play alone. They like to improvise, but they like to do it all by themselves. Whereas acoustic players, people who come up through maybe more traditional music backgrounds, they see improvising as a collective process, and I like that. I like to do that, and I like to be involved with both acoustic and electronic musicians. I'm really improvising with musicians, not with instruments.
Right. That's actually an interesting point. I had not thought about it that way, but you are right. Now, my old collaborator, Grant Richter, used to talk about doing group improv, and the problems with electronics is that a person using electronics can make all the noise. And so if you have a group of those people, there tends to be like too much noise or too much noise all the time because everyone can do the whole frequency spectrum. How do you combat something like that? Because I did notice in looking at your discography and stuff, you've done a lot of work in duos and trios, and the work that I heard was very much not everybody playing all at once. And so it was, you obviously are keyed into something. What for you is like the key to keeping it orderly, I guess?
Actually, I think that's quite simple, at least as an idea. In practice, maybe not so simple. But basically, for me, improvising is not about playing. I think the key to improvising is listening. And if you get the listening in the front, rather than the playing in the front, I think a lot of that takes care of itself.
Right, that makes a lot of sense.
I would say though that there's a collateral problem with that, which is not so much people playing too much or electronic players playing too much, but when you have group improvisation where there are several electronic players, you can have trouble with the listening from the standpoint that there's a difference between group improvisations and performances of contemporary composition, both of which may have very similar vocabularies on some occasions. I think there's importance to the fact that a composition is usually something that's been written by one person, and therefore all of the voices are stemming from one creative imagination originally. Whereas a group improvisation is really a group of creators who are dialoguing.
Right.
And in the practical sense, what that means is if you're listening to a group improvisation, you want to be able to identify what's coming from whom because you want to hear the dialogue. And when there are two or three electronic players, it's sometimes very difficult to know who's doing what. That can really interfere with the listening.
That's really intense. I'm going to want to come back to that because there's some more nuggets there that I want to ask you about. But before we get there, I'm curious, in looking at your background, it's clear you have a background as a woodwinds player and quite accomplished one, but over time you morphed into less and less acoustic instruments and more electronics. First of all, what is your background and how did you get to the point of being into contemporary and modern and experimental music. But then secondly, what is that transition from acoustic instrument to electronics? Why did that happen? And what compelled you to make that move?
That's a great question, and my answer may be different from that of a lot of people who seem, at least on the surface, to have done the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, that's the second half of the process. My early interest in music was in electronic music. I started out being more interested in that than in acoustic music. When I was about 10 years old, my family moved to England. That was coincided with what was probably the second year of the existence of Doctor Who,
Okay.
which means that that was the period when the BBC's electronic music workshop was just absolutely hot as a firecracker. I mean, they were really breaking new ground, both in terms of defining electronic vocabulary and discourse, and in terms of how they were using that in audiovisual settings. And I was a kid, and I was just fascinated that it was a sound world that I had never heard before. I don't think anybody had. I mean, it was really new for everybody, and it was very exciting. It was it had a narrative thread because it was hooked up with TV.
Mm-hmm.
And that was fascinating for me. It was exciting. It was new. It was different. It was surprising. It was unexpected, and it was emotionally very involving. So that was one of the first things to make me really want to be involved with music. But needless to say, when you're 10, they're not, especially if you're 10 in the mid 60s. No one is going to say, okay, well, here are our children's classes of introductory electronic music.
Right.
You're going to get stuck with a flute or a trombone or whatever, whoever makes those decisions decides they want you to do or thinks you're right for. So I became involved with wind instruments because that was kind of the direction I was nudged into following, and I don't regret that at all. But I have to say that in the latter part of my involvement with woodwind instruments, they were more acoustic synthesizers than really melodic instruments for me.
Sure.
So the transition really was a return more than a. I mean, if you think about a lot of piano players, for example, improvising piano players who they can either play the piano or they can improvise, not because there's anything wrong with pianos, but just because there aren't anywhere in most of the places where they want to go and make music with people. So they wind up turning to something else, which is often electronics.
Right.
And then there are people who come into electronic music via fine arts, for example. At least in Europe, there are a lot of people who studied fine arts and then became involved with laptop or amplified objects or no input mixer, and they don't come from a musical background at all. So I guess my trajectory is a little bit different than the run-of-the-mill one. That succinctly would be the process.
Sure. That's actually interesting because it's something that rings true for me. I grew up and grew through the system at roughly the same time. And I think one of the things that people can't appreciate is that it used to be that there were a lot of kinds of music that were not easily approached directly. So for me, when I was going from high school to college, I really wanted to study jazz, but at the time there were very few programs where you could directly study jazz. It always had to be sort of like an adjunct to, oh, you're a cello player also. If you wanted to learn guitar, you also had to kind of work with cello because guitar wasn't one of the instruments that was commonly taught.
Sure.
And likewise with electronics, oftentimes it was sort of like an adjunct area of study to people who were studying composition rather than an area of study on its own.
Oh, sure. Well, my electronic studies were via composition as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say it was very interesting for me. When I entered the doctoral program in Columbia, all of the doctoral candidates in composition were obliged to take an introductory electronic music course. That really was a dividing line, shall we say.
Sure.
there were people who were in that course who came from pencil and paper composition, and they had evolved quite elaborate and very successful. I mean, they got into the doctorate at Columbia, so they knew what they were doing.
Right.
They had evolved very successful means of organizing their sonic materials conceptually. But they were totally flabbergasted when they went into an electronic music laboratory and things made sounds. And they didn't know what to do with sounds.
Sure.
They knew what to do with concepts about organizing sounds, but they didn't want to actually be involved with the sound. I mean, that's what performers were for,
Right. Right.
And then there were some of us who walked into an electronic music lab, and it was like, oh, yeah, finally, I'm home. You push this, and it goes,
Right.
that's fantastic, and so that was a definite separation.
Yeah, I understand how it makes sense. And realistically, this concept of sound, I mean, it goes back to what you were talking about a little bit before as well, which is that some people are able to approach electronic music from the sound and sort of like the love of sound rather than the compositional approach. And I actually kind of envy people who are able to come with that, because everything must seem magical and new. I mean, coming up with your first triad, pure triad must seem so magical, right?
Well, I think that there has to be some kind of middle ground, really. One of the things that I find with a lot of people who come into electronic music from the fine arts, for example, and they do tend to arrive from a certain fascination with sound, and often do, in fact, come up with some very interesting sonic material, but they very often have no idea how to structure things in time.
Right.
All of their visual arts work has to do with structuring things in space.
Yeah.
And then they have a very clear sense of that. They can grab a pencil and just draw something very quickly, and it works. But they don't have that sense of how things evolve over time, or how different kinds of material interact with human memory. And I think that's something that you get through musical training and listening and experience. I mean, to me, that's what makes Haydn such a fascinating composer. You go to see one of his concerts, and when you come out, you've got his little melody stuck in your head for a week.
Right.
He perfectly understood human memory.
Yeah.
Knew exactly how to choose material that was memorable enough that if you wanted to, you could follow it through time and hear how he was structuring his music.
In a way, I think, so I came up as a guitar player, and guitar is one of those instruments that isn't necessarily directly attached to human activity. And I say it where you grew up as a woodwind player, and I always think of horns and winds and stuff as having this kind of unique connection to the human body, which is that you can't really do something longer than a breath, right? Everything has to be broken into breath-long phrases or miniature structures. And I think that actually connects more closely to how the brain operates anyway, and makes it so that some of those melodic devices and stuff are a little bit more easy to develop or easy to sort of integrate into your own voice.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something that's really true. And in fact, I think it has a slightly larger scale than that. I think it has to do with the relationship between human proportions and music. That can actually even be traced farther than that. I mean, if you look at Corbusier's Modulor, for example, you have an argument in favor of architecture with human proportions. And in music, you have, the idea that, that breath is the determinant in phrase. So then that brings things into a human scale. And that is something that, as a woodwind player, you do notice about some pianists and some guitarists, that they don't seem to breathe.
Right.
They just go on and on and on and on and on and on. And then when you take it into composition, then what you get is multiple levels of proportions, multiple scales. Phrase as versus an entire section,
Right.
and so you have a different hierarchy there. But in just a purely discursive way, just in terms of language, the music tends to reflect the proportions of the human body. And that's something that I think is very interesting. One of your first questions for me today was about how to deal with not having too much music going on at the same time when several people are improvising together, especially when one of them is an electronic person. And I think it's interesting to put that into the perspective of Berlin reductionism. What happened when the Berlin improvisers began improvising in extremely reduced ways with a lot of silence and a lot of space, a lot of very quiet sounds. The reason I mention this is because the generation before them in Berlin were still very involved with free jazz, and they associated intensity, they associated being extremely involved with your music, they even associated, I would say, artistic commitment with playing loud, playing fast, being really physically involved in the music. And then this generation of reductionists that came up in the 1990s, they turned the whole thing around. They said, we don't want the intensity to be in the gesture, we want it to be in the listening.
Right.
We want it to be in the focus. And they began to develop a musical language that was not based on physical proportions. I mean, I remember playing with one of the percussionists, Burkhard Bynes, who he would put a little stopwatch on top of his bass drum and arbitrarily set it for a period of time, and he would make a silence that long. And when it got to the end of that time, he would enter again. So he was playing against his intuition, but not in the Cagean sense, rather in the sense that this is not something that comes to me intuitively as a drummer who is so rooted in gesture.
Right. Right.
So that whole sense of how air makes you proportion your work as a woodwind player is something that needed to be questioned and was questioned by free improvisers in the 1990s. And all of us, I think, have changed how we listen and how we understand musical phrase as a result of their work.
That's real interesting, because one of the things that it strikes me, and you actually do like workshops about improvisation and stuff like that. So you're actually actively working with people to help them understand how to become better improvisers. What it sounds to me like is that a big part of your effort might be just in helping people break out of their habitual patterns.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to tell people, although I think you can tell them until the cows come home, they really have to kind of discover it for themselves, is that a free improv workshop, a workshop on free improvisation, it is an improv workshop, but it's also a freedom workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times what people need is help in discovering how to, or daring to be free. The music is already there. The imagination is already there. Even the capacity to listen is there, at least in potentially. But the freedom is what's most been squashed or distorted by years of, at the very least, years of existing in this world. And worse yet, possibly, particular approaches to musical education that have actually done them a lot of harm.
Interesting. Yeah, right. Huh. One of the things I want to do for people who might not be as familiar with the term or the terminology, you talk a lot about your work in terms of being free improvisation. Yeah. And I think it's useful to have you describe that because, well, I think I know what you mean. Even I should be sure, but I think a lot of people who might have come to the discourse from a different direction might not. So can you explain what you mean by free improv versus just standard improv?
Sure. I would say a jazz piece is kind of like a roundtable discussion. Mm-hmm. You got a group of people who know the subject matter. That's why they're chosen for that round table. You've got a predetermined subject, and then people usually have an opportunity to individually put forth their ideas on that subject, and then there's a group discussion of that subject. So there's a structure in that whole conversation. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of hopefully creative thinking and hopefully a lot of listening going on, but there's an awful lot of baggage, a lot of previously learned material that's being brought into play.
Right.
And often also a lot of quotations, a lot of people quoting authorities in the matter, both to support their ideas and to show that they've read the authorities and that they're familiar with them. I think a lot of jazz playing is like that. You take a solo on a tune that people already know what the tune is, the changes are there, they've been fixed, they've been set up. Maybe you quote Dexter Gordon or you quote any of an innumerable number of historic jazz players. And those quotes, they're relevant, but they also show that you know what you're doing. You've got the chops, you know the tradition, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's almost like a shorthand validation that you belong.
Right. Now, a free improvisation is a lot more like a spontaneous conversation. You get a group of people together and they talk about something. They don't know what it's going to be. They don't know where it's going to go. They don't know when the subject is going to change. Some of them have a deep knowledge of what's being discussed. Others are just really funny. And some of them spend most of the time listening, and then when they open their mouths, they really surprise people because they do have something to say. There's no predetermined subject. People arrive knowing what they know. I'm not saying that everything is invented on the spot. You don't get a group of people together to suddenly have a conversation about
nuclear physics, right?
Yeah, exactly. If they don't know anything about that, they don't know anything about it. But drawing on what they know, they may have a very interesting, spontaneous conversation with people they've never met, even.
Right.
Yeah. So that's free improvisation is closer to that.
Now, one of the things that I try and think of is other sort of like areas of artistry or areas of work where you see this kind of thing. And one of the areas that I guess for me has sort of like a visible connection or visible similarity to the different kinds of improvs are improvisational comedy, right? Mm-hmm. When you get comedians working together, especially in like skit comedy, there tends to be two kinds of things. So I used to live near Chicago, and I would occasionally go to see Second City. And in Second City, what they would do is they would sort of like pick ideas from the crowd, and they'd build up these little skits based off of this stuff. But you could actually kind of see them very carefully choosing things that already fit within their framework of what they're going to say, or what kind of jokes they already have in their pocket, or even sometimes picking ideas where they know how their partners will react to it, right? So they might be like, a sexual situation in a bar, right? Well, everybody already has probably done that kind of skit 50 times, so everyone has a comfort level with how everyone else is going to react, right? Where then there's other kinds of improvs, and I think of things like Curb Your Enthusiasm, the way that show is shot. Or they basically get a bunch of people with similar experiences and basically say, the scenario is this. What do you think? And because people have the right background, their reactions are they're personal, they're idiosyncratic, but they're appropriate for the situation and appropriate for their personalities. And I find that to be kind of an interesting parallel. What are some things that you think of when you think of similarities or sort of like metaphors for improvisation and improvisational work?
Well, I'm going to answer your question a little bit laterally.
Okay.
Because I think you touched on a point there that's really worth commenting. People drawing on things they're familiar with. I think people who are not directly involved with musical improvisation, especially free improvisation, may well think that to take two people who've never met each other and put them on stage and say, okay, here's the audience, and here you are, and go. They may think that that is a level of risk for a group of musicians that's really quite close to the top of the conceivable list. In fact, what happens is something very similar to what you seem to have mentioned, which is often in a situation like that, people look for common denominators. They're looking for a certain level of safety so that they can, and rightly so, maybe work together and make something that they feel is musical. So the result is that often the highest levels of risk are not when you put a group of people who don't know each other together to improvise freely, but when you have a group of people who improvise together on a regular basis. Because what happens, and this is the best reading of this. There is another reading that I'll mention, but when it really works, what happens is you improvise with people whom you've improvised with quite a few times, so you trust them.
Right.
So the result is you don't have to look for a common denominator. You don't have to do what you always do. You can really, really go out on a limb because you know you're working with people you can trust. So the levels of risk can be really quite high. Now, there can be a problem with groups that free improvise regularly, which is really not a problem of free improvisation. It's a problem of human relations, which is that the thing, after a few weeks or months, it turns into a series of little games that people play out once and again and again and again. Because, but that's, as I say, that's not a problem of free improvisation. I mean, there are plenty of marriages that have the same problem.
Okay.
So it has to do, I think, with having the maturity to say, okay, I'm not going to stay in my comfort zone,
Right.
especially because I know I don't have to.
Right.
I know I can trust these people, so I'm going to really go out there, And also something that happens with theater improvisation, and that also happens in free improvisation, musical free improvisation, but not quite in the same way. I think in theater improvisation, what you get sometimes is a sort of deliberate challenging, where a situation is set up, as you say, maybe suggested beforehand, a scenario, and the people get involved, but they seem to be trying to say something that will completely flabbergast the other person.
Oh, right.
There seems to be a real interest in trying to throw the other person off their mark. In musical free improvisation, it doesn't have that competitive kind of challenge. It's more like just not having to be as polite and as correct as you do in a normal social conversation. You can throw a wrench into the works, and actually the others will be happy you did, because it brings about some kind of change in the music that can be a liberating experience.
Right. Now, it's interesting you bring up that point, because that is something that, from my days in studying with jazz, one of the reasons I became uncomfortable working on becoming a jazz musician was that sort of competitive nature to it. Mm-hmm. And I grew increasingly aware of it and increasingly uncomfortable with there being a competitive aspect to this. I didn't care for that. It didn't seem to help me move my creative voice forward. And I think for some people it does. I think some people need sort of like the excitement of competition in order to buckle down and work harder, right? Mm-hmm. For me, it was almost a distraction. It was like, well, that hyper competitiveness makes me not want to play with people, and not wanting to play with people means that I become isolated in my work, and I tend to sort of like spiral nose first into the dirt kind of quickly, right? And so I found that avoiding that competitive thing and instead working on a more collaborative thing really helped me improve my voice and my improvisational work, my performance work, right?
Sure, by all means.
And I find that still to this day, whenever I have what I would consider not a great performance, and I go try and figure out what happened, it's either because I felt like there was a competitive thing going on, or I recognized that the person that I was playing with had some sort of competitive thing going on. And that always seems to just like put the brakes on a real free and open exchange in those kind of environments.
I agree with you, and I think it happens. I wish it were limited to some specific kind of music or even just to music.
Right.
Unfortunately, I think that happens in all kinds of dialogue-oriented discourses. I think in free improvisation in particular, there can be a misunderstanding of the sort of social dynamics involved. Um,
Right.
what I mean by this is those of us who were trained as musicians in musics other than free improvisation, which is almost all musicians, because very few people start
Right.
their musical training as free improvisers. We're often taught what is essentially a binary relationship in which it's us and the public. And we have a product, which is a score or a tune that somebody in the band has written or whatever. And we rehearse it until it's fully worked out. And then we go on stage kind of like delivery boys, and we deliver this product to the audience,
Right.
which has come and is sitting there in silence that's socially imposed, even in classical music, and they're waiting for us to deliver this product to them. They even view themselves as essentially passive, although the
Right.
musicians don't see them as passive because they're so aware of the expectations that are placed on them by the audience. When
Right.
you deal with free improvisation, the minute you start to think about it as listening rather than as playing, you realize that there's a circle there. In other words, what are we doing on stage? We're listening. What is the audience doing? Oh, they're listening. When we rehearse, what position do we assume? Well, we usually set up as a circle. And when we go on stage, what do we do? Well, we set up as a half circle, a
Uh-huh.
semicircle, and the audience is the other half.
It's included in the structure,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's right. And we know that how they listen has an enormous effect on how we play. You know when the people that are listening to you are bored to death. You know when they're really excited about what you're playing. And you play differently
Mm-hmm.
as a result. So the minute you start to see this as something that we're all sharing, rather than as, oh my God, I've got to do something, I got to make a show for this audience, I have to entertain them. That ties in very quickly with I've got to show them I know what I'm doing, and I've got to be the best and the brightest and the prettiest. And that change in paradigm can really help deal with the sort of competitive and show oriented thing. I think probably those of us who've worked with improvisation a lot, besides the experience that you were describing of really uncomfortable levels of competition, we've also had the experience that you begin to improvise with someone in a private situation like rehearsals, and establish a pretty good dialogue with them. Then when you take it on stage, the other person turns to the audience and emits directly towards the audience as if you weren't there anymore.
Right.
And all of that dialogue that you've established with them in the rehearsals just evaporates. This comes from the same problem, from not understanding it as a shared process of listening, but thinking of it as I'm here to deliver a product.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not to mention that when you get on stage as an improviser, you don't have a product, you have a process. You
Right.
don't have anything all worked out that you're going to deliver. At least you hope not.
Right. So with your work, do you ever do prearranged works, or is everything that you do completely improvised?
Okay, I work in several different things. It all involves improvisation,
Mm-hmm.
but some of it is just full out free improvisation. In other words, any resources I have that are relevant in the moment, I will use. That
Right.
to me, that's pure free improvisation. But I also work and have been working since about 1985 with sound portraits. And sound portraits for me involve working with a sense of place, which is not necessarily the place where I am. I'm not talking about site-specific improvisation, although I do that too, and I find it extremely interesting. Working with sound portraits usually means going somewhere and doing a series of field recordings in that place, and then using only those field recordings and combining them with my free playing to make portraits of the experience of that place.
Oh my God.
So that's, I don't know how to describe that because it's not like having a chord progression or saying, okay, the two of us are going to play for 5 minutes and then the third guy's going to come in and
Right.
then 2 minutes later the second guy's going to go out. It's not that kind of structuring,
Right.
but it may be a choice of material. We're going to improvise freely with this material.
Well, that's actually really interesting. It's funny that you mentioned that. And first of all, I love the moniker of calling them sound portraits. That seems to be really appropriate for what you're talking about. But it's also something that I've been thinking about doing lately. I recently moved to a different part of the country, and it's an area that's a lot more rural. And I find that the sound environments are very different from what I was working or what I was living in before. And as a result, it's given me an awareness of the sound of my surroundings. And I was thinking about, how could that be incorporated? But the other thing that it sounds like it does for you, as improvisers with electronics underneath our fingers, we do sort of have the endless options scenario, right? And so by taking something like that, it almost seems to provide the kind of limits to that piece of work that can lead to focus.
Yeah, I have a lot of things to say about that. First of all, those of us who are or have been instrumentalists know that there's an inverse relationship between variety and uniformity, by which I mean if you take out your instrument and you try and play the same phrase, exactly the same 50 times, because you're learning it or it's in the score, it just doesn't come out right, and you just have to play it until it does. All 50 of those times, it will be slightly different from all of the other 49
Right.
because you're trying to make it the same. It's when you try and do something different that you begin to come up against your limitations and realize how similar what you're doing is one time to another. When you limit your material deliberately, variety appears on a different level.
Right.
I'll give you an example. I'm working on a set of sound portraits right now about the Canary Islands. I was in Tenerife, which is one of the nicer islands, although they're all awful nice. I made a recording of two men arguing about soccer. So here's what happens. If you're from the island of Tenerife and you hear that recording in the middle of an improvisation, what you're going to hear is two guys arguing about soccer. If you're from one of the other Canary Islands, what you're going to hear is two guys from Tenerife arguing about soccer. If you're from the Spanish mainland, what you're going to hear is two guys from the Canary Islands arguing about soccer. If you're from Latin America, you're going to hear two Spaniards arguing about soccer. And if you don't speak Spanish, you're going to hear two men talking. So you're going to hear their intonation, you're going to hear their rhythms, you're going to hear their accents. You may intuit some of their emotions, but you don't understand the words. So what you're hearing is rhythms and pitches, basically. For me as an improviser, that's material that I want to work with on all those different levels. I want it to function rhythmically in the piece, but if there are understandable references, they're inevitably going to cause me to react musically one way rather than another. So that's a theoretically a very limited little tidbit of something, just a couple of guys talking about their soccer game. But in fact, it has all these different levels that you can work with and that you can work with more or less at the same time.
Right.
So if you read art history stuff about portraiture, you often have them talking about how the painter has read the personality of the person he's portraying, and how you can sense that personality in how the painter has portrayed that person. It's not just a picture of some guy's face.
Right.
So to me, that's where the portraiture begins.
That's fascinating. That's really a great insight into the things you're doing. I appreciate that. Well, remarkably, we've already kind of run out of time. I wish we could continue this conversation. I'm going to have to put you on the list to come back, because this has been a fascinating dive into some really interesting thought areas. And I appreciate
thank you, Darwin.
that.
Yeah, I do too.
So for people that are going to be interested in hearing some of your work, or reading about some more about your background or your ideas, what's the best place for people to look up information about you?
Probably my webpage. I have to say that since I live in Spain and work predominantly in Europe, a lot of the stuff on my webpage, including most of the articles there, are not in English.
Okay.
But quite a bit of it is, too. And there's a list of all of my, almost all of my CDs. I'm kind of slow putting some of them on there. And that's www.wadematthews, Matthews with 2 T's, .info.
Okay.
wadematthews.info.
Okay, great. And for people who want to hear some of your work, is it available like on Spotify or streaming in some way?
I believe it is.
Okay.
I know people have told me that they have listened to stuff, but that's something that I think the owners of the record companies have really handled more than me.
All right. Okay, well, cool. Hopefully that gives people a starting point, at least, to track down some of your work, because I think you've opened up some really interesting doors, and I hope that people are going to also take the opportunity to learn a little bit more about your work and what those ideas sound like in practice. So,
well, I would have to add one thing to that, Darwin, which is that I'm a musician. I make music.
Right.
And I like to go and make music, and I like to go and share ideas in workshops and in lectures. So if they really are interested, I would say take the musical approach to the old saying, write the book you'd like to read.
Right.
If you're interested in hearing some of my music, just get in touch and let's set up a concert, or a workshop or a lecture or all three.
That sounds fantastic.
That's what I do, and that's what I want to do,
Indeed. All right. Well, Wade, I want to thank you so much for your time and for really diving into some of this stuff. It was fascinating.
Thank you, Darwin. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to doing it the next time.
All right. Have a great day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, many thanks to Wade for the great discussion. It's really interesting to hear about his views on improv and his views on how musicians work together. I appreciated the in-depth review, and I hope you did too. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for hanging out. Please share this with your friends and other people you might find that might be interested in this. Otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon, like next week. Bye.